You know, the vast majority of stuff we talk about on this channel is nuts and bolts based. There's also the economic end of things, and for the most part we talk about, you know, building cars economically, you know, finding them cheaply, negotiating for good deals and all of that, building stuff on a budget. But there's also like the bigger picture, you know, that's what we do is the micro, but then you've got the macro. It's like, you know, what trends are in place, what things are driving the market and the prices and the availability of the cars that we deal with. So given that Barrett Jackson was just on this last weekend, you know, spent some time watching that, and going by some posts, it's a reoccurring thing that I see like on Facebook posts and different forums, people talking about how even though like the 60s and 70s cars are crazy popular now, that it's a nostalgia thing, and that when the people who had these cars die off, the prices are gonna, you know, go down. But I don't believe that that's the case here. The things that are driving the market prices on 60s and 70s cars, and not just muscle cars, it's been muscle cars to this point, and that market got started over 30 years ago. It's not just the glory cars now that are going. It's a bigger picture, and it has more to do with the history of our country and our culture than it does you know, people reminiscing about cars they had when they were, you know, 20 years old, 30 years old. And the example of that, like we just did the thing on the Rambler, my friend Travis, he's 22. I've got another friend, Alex, he's 20 years old. He runs around town here in a 70 Satellite 4-door. You guys, you know, the audience, our audience, very young. We got a lot of 15, 16, 17-year-olds, and then, you know, a lot of 25 to 30-year-old guys who love these 60s, 70s cars. You don't see the same enthusiasm for 30s or 40s cars. You know, you don't see it for 80s and 90s cars. It's not nostalgia for these guys. Now, if you stop and you think about it, you know, 1970 was 50 years ago, 49 years, 50 years ago. If you're a 20-year-old kid, your parents weren't even born yet. Most likely your parents weren't even born yet when these cars were new. So it's not a nostalgia-driven thing. It's a social deal. It's a societal thing. Okay, like I was in the supermarket the other morning buying dog food, and you know, the supermarket, and I'm listening to the Ramones over the, you know, from the 70s or middle 70s. You look at TV commercials, they use songs and jingles and ideas and slogans and cars from the 60s and the 70s. You know, their target audience aren't 70-year-old people. Their target audience is the 25 to 45-year-old, you know, major buying demographic. And they're using these images from the 60s and 70s to sell these products. It's a little weird, you know, for somebody like I'm in that middle age, you know, where I'm older than, you know, the typical buyer, and I'm younger than, you know, the guy who would actually be, you know, nostalgic for 1968, you know, whatever it happens to be. So here's the market. Here's where I see it go. Actually, here's the forces behind the market. You got a period of time between, let's say, and again, you know, listen to me. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, right? And there are, you know, things that happen outside of this window. But this is like the crux of it, okay? In the years between 1955 and 1985, right, we had okay, the 40s, you know, people call them the greatest generation, and they were. I mean, you know, you look at what we were able to accomplish during World War II, you know. These were amazing people. But societally, wasn't really, you know, an interesting time, you know. Things were still very, you know, very laid back. Things were still very, you know, a lot of American pride, but not so much, you know, not a lot of glitz or sparkle with it. Around 1955, the affluence started to kick in. And towards the later part of the 50s, you had things like the bikini and the birth control pill, and things started to get a little, you know, crazier. You know, then you had the Beatles, you know, 1964 or so. So basically, you had a society that was like loosening up. It was getting into party mode, you know. And everything at that time was very looking forward. Everything was very optimistic, you know. Everything was about the now, you know, and the future. And actually, that's like when I was a kid, a young kid, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. That's what it was. Everything was like the now thing, you know, the future thing, you know. And that kind of ended right around 1970, 1971. So you take those years between 55, when things started to get interesting, to where they maxed out. We reached our cultural high water mark about halfway between 55 and 85, which was 1970. Things started to really turn and become negative right around 1972. Just about the time that Nixon closed the gold window to international redemption, inflation started to kick off. And the first place that it really was felt was the Arab oil embargo, which was basically a revenge move for, you know, the gold thing. So, and that kicked off inflation, crazy inflation. So by the early part of the 1970s, 1973, 1974, people were feeling a lot of pressure. Things weren't as optimistic as they were. And ironically enough, right exactly at that time, a film called American Graffiti came out. Which, now remember, I was 10 years old when American Graffiti came out. And I thought, you know, boy, this is really weird. You know, like the biggest movie, you know, this whole cultural phenomenon is based on something from the past. This isn't like the now anymore. You know, and then a couple of years later, you know, you had Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley, and it was this whole 50s nostalgia thing happening in the 70s. And it was like nobody really wanted to live in the 70s. Everybody wanted to live in the 50s. And that never changed. You know, yeah, people don't necessarily want to live in the 50s anymore, but nobody wants to live in the current era. If you look at the hottest cars, you know, the Chevy Camaro, the Ford Mustang, the Dodge Challenger, they were all styled and named after their 1969, 1970 counterparts. So this is the thing that's going on societally here. We've pretty much, and we've hit a brick wall. There is no viable pop culture anymore. There is no, you know, back in the, if you go to the 70s, you know, when things were still kind of okay, you know, societally, culturally, like things were still a little bit optimistic. You know, you had, you know, there was a community television, right? Everybody watched the same shows. People had that thing that held them together. Everybody listened to the same radio stations. They had the same kind of music going on. So you had a pretty intact or a cohesive vibe that ran all the way through society. And, you know, you don't have that anymore. There's a void. And the cars, the images, the ideas, anything that goes back to that era of, you know, 1860s, early 1970s, means something more than just nostalgia. It's something that's more than just, you know. And the nature of today's cars is also driving the market. One of the few places I actually look to for, like, you know, news, I try to sort from the network news. There's a site called Zero Hedge. It's an aggregate news service, mostly based around financial things. And they did a story a few days ago. They ran a story a few days ago about the inflation built into, you know, the car market. And I'm talking about hedonics, you know, the way things are calculated based on, you know, the value of items added to, you know, besides the point. I read the article and then I started reading the comments. And what I saw, and remember now, this is not a car site, and these are not car people, but there was a common thread through the comments that went something like this. I'll read this one here. Engines may last longer nowadays, but pretty much everything else falls apart sooner or is made crappier. Most purchases really just doing the beta testing nowadays. The transmission on my Ford is complete garbage. You want anything decent, you buy vintage. That's not a car guy. I mean, he may be a car guy, but it's not a car site, right? That's the overwhelming, people are starting to catch on. The cars that are produced today are appliances. They work great, you know, when they're new, but they can't be repaired by the average person. It's hard to love an appliance. It's just something that gets you from point A to point B. And people who are slightly automotive inclined know that it's beyond their capability to actually work on this thing like the way they did with the older cars. They want that bond with their cars. They want to be able to Saturday afternoon open the hood, climb underneath, change the oil, change the spark plugs. Even if they're not car people, real car people, they still want to be able to at least know that, yeah, I have some control over my machinery. And the stuff that they build today, you have no control over it. One of the big differences between the cars of today, let's say you take a 1970 Challenger and you take a 2018 Challenger, and the 2019 Challenger is generally faster. It's definitely got more features. It's got everything under the sun, everything you could ask for. But the difference between the 1970 and the 2019 is that the 1970 car will survive a hailstorm and the 2019 car won't. So essentially that's what's driving the market. And now that it seems like the whole thing about muscle cars, 60s, 70s muscle cars, has kind of like, I don't want to say it's faded away, but it's not really in the limelight anymore, mostly because today's cars do perform so well. It's mostly the styling and the feel and the durability of 1960s, 1970s cars that's the appeal. And I'm seeing a trend among younger guys, and again, Travis with that Rambler that we featured the other day, and obviously the feedback that we get from you guys reading all of your comments, that's what I'm seeing. I believe that over the next 5 to 10 years, what would be the common American family car, the 4-door sedan, the station wagon, the 2-door with a 6-cylinder and a 3-speed on a tree, AM radio, right? Lots of little, trinkets and gingerbread, all of the stuff we hated back in the day, gingerbread, right? Anything that's pre-malaise era, meaning like anything built before opera windows and faux Mercedes grills. I think those cars are the ones that are going to appreciate the most, and I think they've got the highest desirability level. And it's not just the Americans that are pushing this market. I like Indian food, so once a week or so we'll go out to eat Indian food. And I noticed a few years ago, any Indian restaurant you go into, they always have a TV playing that has Bollywood, right? This musical stuff. It's like crazy. If you've never seen it, it's crazy. It's just like over the top. And what I noticed a few years ago is that a lot of their videos feature American cars. So they'll have, and these are like, like the ballers, the playboys of India, right? And this is a country with over 1 billion people and like it's super affluent, right? Mixed in between the Lamborghinis and the Ferraris are like, 1968 Mustangs and 1967 Dodge Dart. There was one I saw recently where it featured a black 1967 Dodge Dart, right? When 1960s, common 1960s American passenger cars become Playboy status symbols in a country like India, and I'm sure in China now too. China's changed the import laws. They're allowed to register older cars now. So you've got even, wealthy Chinese people who are like, I want a piece of that, vintage American, iron thing because it was the world standard, and basically it still is the world standard. So you're going to see these cars start to get sucked up into those markets, and the prices are just going to keep going higher and higher and higher. If you're speculating for the future, that's where I would be. The 10-year plan, I would get my hands on every single vintage 1960s, early 1970s, basically V8 rear-wheel drive, conventional, American car. I'd get my hands on everything every part I could find, every car I could find. I would get deep into that market because I have a funny feeling over the next 3, 4, 5 years, it's going to explode. The prices of those cars are going to go to places where you just cannot believe. So anyway, that's it. I'll see you tomorrow.